My name is Natasha Montague of Americans for Tax Reform. I'm narrating this Economics 101 video for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity to help more people understand the issue of tax competition and why it is a liberalizing force in the global economy. First, let's define tax competition. Tax competition is a process by which governments use tax policy to compete with each other for jobs and economic investment. Consider what recently happened during a lame duck session of the Illinois legislature. Politicians rammed through a big increase in the state's income tax, from 3% to 5%, as well as a big hike in the tax burden on business. Immediately, lawmakers from Wisconsin and Indiana publicly invited entrepreneurs, investors, companies, and other job creators to come across the border. Or what about last decade, when New Mexico's then Democratic governor slashed taxes, including a big reduction in the top income tax rate, from 8.2% to 4.9%. Why did he reject the class warfare approach advocated by Obama and other Democrats? Governor Richardson bluntly remarked that businesses move to states where taxes are falling, not rising. The same thing is happening all around the world, especially now that globalization has made it so much easier for jobs and investment to cross borders in search of better tax policy. Top tax rates in the developed world have dropped from more than 67% on average to about 40%. This dramatic shift was triggered by the Reagan and Thatcher tax cuts about 30 years ago. Once economic activity began to flow to the United States and United Kingdom, other nations had to lower tax rates to keep pace. Even the French and Germans lowered their top tax rates. The same thing is true for business taxes. The corporate tax rate used to average about 48%, but now the average corporate tax rate in the developed world is less than 25%. Did governments lower these tax rates because decision makers were reading Milton Friedman? While it would be optimal if all politicians were well-read economists, it's much more likely that they reduced tax rates to stay competitive with nations such as Ireland, which attracted lots of economic activity thanks to a corporate rate of just 12.5%. The same is true for tax reform. When I was born, you could count the number of flat tax jurisdictions on one hand. Now we have about 30 nations with a simple and fair system. Good leaders in some nations have been critical, but the driving force for tax reform has been a desire to attract jobs and investment. Not surprisingly, a lot of politicians don't like tax competition. They sometimes resent having to lower tax rates, and they don't like it when they do raise taxes and taxpayers escape across borders. For all intents and purposes, they want to be like monopolists, without any constraints to tax and spend. In the United States, some of these politicians are trying to stop tax competition from the internet. They want a sales tax cartel, which they call the Streamlined Sales Tax Project. It would give states the right to tax purchases that take place in other states and would require a massive erosion of privacy, since politicians and bureaucrats would know what consumers buy. Internationally, inefficient high-tax governments are trying to thwart tax competition by stamping out so-called tax havens. In reality, this is a campaign against low taxes. And if they succeed, it will do great damage to international commerce and undermine tax reform and fiscal sovereignty. The economics of this issue are straightforward, but don't believe me. We're showing on the screen a series of statements from Nobel Prize-winning economists. The basic message from these scholars is that competition is good and monopolies and cartels are bad. And this is true in the public sector as well as the private sector. But this is also an issue of freedom. Everyone should have the right to escape bad policy. And if high-tax governments don't like it when people and companies leave, they should fix their bad policies rather than create tax cartels, which is sort of like setting up an OPEC for politicians. This issue is going to become even more important in the future. The fiscal crisis in nations such as Greece and Portugal is an early warning sign that the welfare state is on the verge of collapse. As this happens, politicians will probably engage in desperate measures to coerce more and more money from society's productive people. Tax competition is a way of telling politicians that there's a limit to their coercive greed. This video will conclude with a list of suggested readings. You can also watch some of the other videos on tax competition and tax havens produced by the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. I encourage you to share this information widely. Thanks for watching. I'm Natasha Montague with Americans for Tax Reform.